Once again, a warm welcome to you all from CBPS. I know it's a long day, as Professor Josna said, but here we come for this exciting and celebration time. Reflections on CBPS. As we complete 25 years, I think it's complete and celebrate this 25 years of our meaningful existence. I think it is very important for us to pause and also reflect upon the journey that we had so far. I think it is best done by none other than Professor Vinod Vyasulu, who co-founded this CBPS and nurtured it and actively supported it at the later stage. Professor Vinod Vyasulu, most of you know very well, an eminent development economist who has done extensive work in public finance, had a PhD from University of Florida, and after that had a very illustrious teaching career in IIM, Bangalore, and then moved to RBI, Institute of Social and Economic Change as RBI chair professor. And he was also very instrumental in creation of Institute of Public Enterprise at Hyderabad. He was its first director. After that, he moved back to Bangalore. He was consulting economist for a few years, and then he founded the CBPS. An author of seven books. He has published more than 100 articles in renowned national and international journals. But if I see him, I have seen him as a research associate under him. To recollect that some of his simpler principles which he had adopted in his way of work was to trust, entrust, and scrutinize. This is what I would like to say. He would trust the researchers to do their work. He would entrust the responsibilities and also finally subject it to third-party scrutiny. This is something that he has followed, and these principles have been followed in CBPS till now. So this was to set a high standard for the work that is done at CBPS. And as a person, is very simple, voracious reader, unassuming man who prefers to keep things very simple. With this small introduction, over to you, sir.
Thank you.
You want to come here? Okay.
And when I celebrate, it's always back to the world of Alice in Wonderland. So
we should which change?
Next.
Yeah, but it's not.
So there's a mismatch between what's on this screen and what's there. Anyway, I have chosen a poem from Jabberwocky, which is talking about a celebration after achieving something. And the words used are that it's a frabjous day. And they yell kola kole and they chortle in their joy. So I think this is very appropriate. If not all of you, I certainly am chortling in joy. And with that, I think we'll move on to the more serious business.
Let's try this.
No, the next one is the one that talks about the various. No, that one is stuck. Okay, let's not worry too much about it. I prefer to speak from here because I've got something I want to consult. And I'll press the wrong button if I keep the paper on top of it there. So on this frabjous day, to be asked to speak and start off a series of Silver Jubilee lectures on institutions and public policy is the charge that the director has given to me. Now, I might slightly misuse the privilege because I thought I would also use it on my personal reflections of this organization over 25 years. So maybe if I can link the two two themes, then that would be a great achievement. But I'm not going to try very hard. None of us, there are several of those who co-founded this institution who are in this room, and I think I can honestly say that none of us thought that the day would come when we'll be celebrating a silver jubilee. So to that extent, it's a very pleasant surprise and a happy one. I'll also speak from memory with the advantage of hindsight, and you all know that memories can be tricky. So it's a good thing that many of those who are part of the journey are here, who can make corrections as and when needed, because I might tend to overstate things and overstate the nice and either miss out or understate the not so nice. So what I say needs validation, let the listener beware. Now, is CBPS an institution? The theme being institutions and public policy, it's necessary to confront this. And to my mind, an institution is a code of behavior that stems from a vision of the way ahead. It includes agreed goals, roles, specific roles, modes of interaction, methods of internal, not conflict resolution, but settling of differences. And it includes the work of all the people within it over a period of its evolution. Now, an institution thus defined exists. Think of Durga Puja in West Bengal. It happens spontaneously. Think of Onam in Kerala, the Dandiya Ras in Gujarat. They happen. There's a code of behavior, there is a clear-cut role for people, and year after year it happens. So it's an institution. But an institution could also be embedded in a formal organization. The Supreme Court of India is embedded in the Constitution. And in that sense, CBPS is an institution that is registered under the Registration of Societies Act, Karnataka 1960, and is therefore a legal person. It's different from those of us who work within it. It's an institution in its own right, and I think it should be assessed in that manner. Now, to restate it, CBPS is a code of behavior in a registered society, and the vision is to create and share knowledge towards an empowered, equitable, just, and democratic society. That's up on the website. It's gone way beyond the initial focus of what we did, to which I will come now, and as you will see from the publications outside, is quite a different animal today. Now, what do we mean by public policy? If I have to link the two, it's also necessary to be clear about that. And by public policy, I at least understand the action or the lack of action of a state or government in responding to some kind of felt need of the public in quotes. It could be disaster relief, it could be healthcare provision, it could be anything that requires the stepping in of a government. So it's the action of governments, and governments at any level, union, state, local, whatever level it is, and not individuals or companies, although these may influence the direction of public policy. The public, of course, is an omnibus term. If we are talking of elections, it is the electorate. If we are talking of nutrition or child nutrition, it is that set of children who may be nourished or malnourished. So it varies. But the problem is that public policy is concerned with problems that markets where buying and selling takes place do not address or do not address efficiently. It addresses what the systems analysts call wicked problems. And an interesting aspect of a wicked problem is that you don't know the resources you work with, you don't quite know the goals you're aiming at. An example is the planning process in India. We all wanted it, we all agreed in general terms, but when it comes to the specifics, there are lots of honest differences, and we are never sure of the resources that are available. And one of the things about a solution to a wicked problem is that what works today could be toxic tomorrow. One example of that would be the Green Revolution, which managed to make us self-sufficient in fruit grains from a time when we were in a bad state. I remember the Bihar famines of 67 and 69, which many of those who were with me in college went and personally saw, bunker being one of them. So today, when you think of the Green Revolution, you think of soil salinity, you think of the fact that you need more and more chemical fertilizer, and you think of various other things that have accompanied it. So a tonic one day and a toxic later, the same thing. So we have to be constantly aware. Public policy is an ongoing process, and it requires constant feedback, because the tonic of today should continue to be applied so long as it remains tonic. Now, one of the things that happens in this thing is that I've been trained as an economist, many of us in this room are, that mainstream economics, from which policy derived its theoretical underpinnings, has been leaning towards a particular school of thought, a supply-side, market-supported, growth-worshipping worldview, and drowning out other heterodox, unconventional approaches, particularly those that considered issues of income and wealth distribution. Ashwini Saith has written a whole book documenting this particular thing, and I've referred to it in the paper, and it should be looked at. But it's important because it shows in great detail that this was not some accidental process, but something ideologically inspired and pushed in place. One of the things about this mainstream economics is that it's gone the mathematical route. These are mathematical truths. Many Nobel Prizes have been given for establishing these propositions. But the point is that mathematical truths, when it comes to policy, need to be validated. After all, Einstein's theory of 1905 was validated by Eddington in 1919. Everyone knew it would be true, but it had to wait for that validation based on observations and so on. And in that sense, a validation is necessary for policy. You cannot just work in the world of abstract theory. So the point is, rigor in research is important, but a lot of mainstream research became so rigorous that as far as policy was concerned, it became rigor mortis. And this was the crisis that I had to deal with. I was interested in applications and solutions to small problems and so on. And the grand theorems of mainstream economics did not help very much. So when I was groping and looking for a solution, I happened to interact with Professor Amulya Reddy in the Indian Institute of Science, who was working with applications of science and technology to rural areas, and who was the one who told me, for example, that science and technology is applied to them is not simple or low class. It requires as much careful thinking and calibration as the science that is required to put a rocket on the moon. And that was an interesting thing, because we would say, oh, bullock cart, it doesn't require much. That's not true. And in fact, a very interesting study done by my director in IIM Bangalore, after a whole lot of tests conducted with the help of the National Aeronautical Laboratory and other things, came to the conclusion that for the conditions in which it was used, the traditional design of the bullock cart is the optimal one. So it was those of us who said we should put tires on it and things like that, who were barking up the wrong tree. So anyway, this was what it is, and in this search for relevance, my wife Poornima Vyasulu played a very big role. I resigned my professorship in ISEC in 1994, basically saying this is not what I want to do. And if it wasn't for her, there'd be no food on the table. But more than that, she worked with me to identify like-minded people and try to find out ways in which we could do what we liked. So that particular effort, let me go back a little bit. I resigned in 1994. And that was the time when the two constitutional amendments were becoming effective, the 73rd and 74th. You know, we're a schizophrenic country. Urban is urban, rural is rural. Basically, you're talking about local governance. But anyway, that apart, these two amendments brought in fundamental changes. The Indian Constitution is a union of states, but after the amendments, we had the union government, we had state governments, and we had constitutionally sanctioned local governments, panchayats at 3 levels in the rural areas, and a whole series of town panchayats, nagar palikas, municipalities, corporations in the urban areas. But the essential was exactly the same thing. In all these cases, within that local jurisdiction, elections would be held, and these elections had reservations for women, they had reservations for SC, STs, and so on. And they would form an elected body, which then would be entrusted with the tasks of local development issues. In that sense, there is really no difference between a Zilla Panchayat Pradhan and a state chief minister in terms of the political theory behind it. But what is interesting is that, well, let me say, as an economist, I'd been looking at taxes and expenditures and so on. So when this particular set of amendments came in, I started saying, look, we know union budgets, we know state budgets, what happens in these local governments? And that led me to understand there's a huge gap there. There were no such things as local budgets. There was expenditure taking place, and after going to a large number of municipalities and districts, I found out that there was an administrative structure based around the deputy commissioner or the collector who represented the government at that level from the civil service side, part of the government on the administrative side. And they were empowered, so the collector authorized it, expenditure was incurred. It could be in a hospital, it could be in a school, it could be in... And after the amendments, it was modified to the extent that for the Zilla Panchayat, there was a chief executive officer. But the system more or less continued. Instead of one collector, there were now 2. The collector stuck to administrative and law and order and other things. And these developmental functions came to the CEO. After a lot of field work and so on, I was very hopeful. But when we went to panchayats, to municipalities, and there are a lot of my colleagues here who did the actual hard work, nobody knew what we were talking about. What we did find was a whole lot of expenditure vouchers. So starting with expenditure vouchers, we tried to find out what money was spent in. We created one side of an account book, that is what was spent. Where did the money come from? Nobody really knew. It came from the district treasury, but what account, where, nobody knew. So the conclusion was that at this level there were no budgets. A budget is a very specific thing. It's a statement of accounts filed by a government before a legislature of some sort, and that approval is taken in order to incur expenditure. So the union or state government level, these are called appropriation bills. And unless and until an appropriation bill is passed, expenditure cannot take place. At the local level, there is no such thing. While the constitutional amendments provided for what they call local self, and the term local self-governance is taken from the Royal Commission of Decentralisation of 1907. It's amazing that the language of the constitutional amendments draws upon that. And I've talked to some of the people who were involved in drafting it, and they claim they didn't know, which only tells me what a strong thing bureaucratic memory is. You can all check for yourself. The report itself is no longer available if you search on Google, but summaries are available. And those summaries are fairly accurate. Now, what was an institution of local self-governance at that time? You know, the districts then were much larger. There would be one collector and maybe 1 or 2 others who had to look after all kinds of things in the district because the presidency governments were far away. And this one particular collector would have a great deal of difficulty dealing with everything. So they need, particularly in terms of law and order, in terms of administration. So this local self-government was legislated. I forget what the reforms of 1905 or 6 were called. But they were legislated, and the members were nominated by the collector. It was his discretion. And the collector had the power to override any decision that local self-government took. But who were nominated was the local money lender, the local landlord, I'm tempted to say local gunda. But whatever it is, they were the powerful people of the locality. And it saved the collector a lot of trouble because they took care of the troublesome natives and things went. Now, Sarojini, we were talking about revenue records. And in this particular background, you can imagine what they did to the revenue records. It's no surprise they're a mess today. So this is how we did. And when we were talking about the work on trying to understand this and create a set of accounts, I met people from the Ford Foundation, program officer called Terence George, who at that time were quite interested in trying to understand local governance. They had funded projects in the Philippines, in Indonesia, and I don't know where else. And they had read the constitutional amendments, and they were curious to see what they could do. So I ran into them, and after some discussion, they said, no, we'll give you a startup grant. Now, I can't receive such a grant as an individual. So I needed a body that. So at that point in time, I turned to a friend of mine, Professor Rajgopalan, unfortunately not here today, who had an organization called Technology Informatics Design Endeavor, TIDE. So he agreed that this grant can be taken and I would be given a table and chair in TIDE. And we took the thing and started working. Again, some of those who worked with me are here. Madhusudan is one of them. And as we kept learning and as we kept working, I'm telling you things today that are based on years of study, reflection, and so on. But each of these was a painful discovery over a period of time based on what happened. And we would also think that, look, we went to 2 panchayats, these are probably atypical. So you had to go to a lot more before you became sort of confident that the state of affairs we were talking about was the norm. Thanks to the grant, we went to other states, went all over the country, and garnered a lot of experience out of this. Finally, we got a second grant from Google, which was a generous grant. Google's interest was in setting up an information system for local governments. So they said, go to panchayats and set it up. We were barely in a position of having accounts. But I took the grant, we started working with it. And the interesting thing was not so much what we found, but the interest that the elected, particularly the women, the SC women, the others who were elected, who basically came from kitchen to panchayat in their personal journeys, were starving for information. When they would talk to the local officials, they'll say, no, you won't understand this, or there is no money. But through the work we did, they began to realize that there was money for drinking water, that there was money for a school, and so on. And if you look at what happened over a period of 4 or 5 years, the agenda in the Gram Panchayat changed significantly. When earlier there were discussions of where to locate a bus stop or where the village road to connect to the main road was to be built. After 4 or 5 years, we found that they were talking about food for children in schools, drinking water, and there were other things happening in Karnataka at that time. One of the most important being Mahila Samakhya. And the Mahila Samakhya was an educational project where the women, they were not being educated, they were being empowered. So in some of the villages we went, they took it on and they said that, look, we will make sure that the children get food. And they slowly began to fight with the contractors who were stealing. And the logic of these women was very simple. It says, these are our kids. Maybe not mine personally, but they're village kids. So we are not going to steal from their food. It's a very interesting dynamic that started. So the work that we did was taken further by organizations like the Mahila Mandals in various districts, different groups. This was also the time when self-help groups were being set up. And these self-help groups would take an interest. Some of them would say, we are doing a lot of work on, credit. It was basically smoothing consumption by having this cushion. And they would take an interest. And given that elections were happening, an interesting thing started happening with those who were working with Mala Samakhya, those who were members of self-help groups, began to take an interest. And by the time 2 or 3 cycles of elections had happened, these women were panchayat members. And when I would go and talk to them, by then, not only were they confident, they were no longer, necessarily the wives of the previous panchayat or whatever. The joke is SP Sarpanchpati. It was true in the beginning. There were wives, daughters, whatever. But by the time 2 or 3 election cycles had happened, they also found that these women who had been in position earlier were a resource. They could tell them about things. They had a support group to fall back on. And not just us, there were a whole lot of NGOs. My wife Poornima was working with Anita Kaul and a filmmaker called Deepa Dhanraj. And they made a whole series of training films, not in the abstract, but by going to the villagers, talking to them, learning their songs and using those songs in the training programs. And because of our link with the Ford Foundation, they made 1,000 copies of it, and this was scattered in many places. So sometimes you're lucky and you start something partly by accident, but circumstances so come that it happens. But strange things do happen in the way things work. The more empowered these village women got and the more ambitious they became. One of these women in Dharwad told me that she wanted to become education minister in Bangalore. That is high ambition. She belonged to Ramakrishna Hegde's party. What basically happened was that the MLAs became threatened. They had won elections, but there were these panchayat women who had a base, who were doing some good work. And if they became ambitious and challenged the MLAs were very worried that their role as MLA, they would lose and somebody else would come in. So there was a backlash from the MLAs, and in Karnataka the act was watered down. The Narasimha Rao government was the one that piloted the reforms. Karnataka had an earlier decentralization act. In 1985, there was a lot of experience with it. Based upon the experiences that I was telling you about, the Congress government of Karnataka, led by Bangarappa, reversed the entire process. So Karnataka, from having been a leader in the Panchayat Raj movement, became a leader in how to kill it. It's an interesting trajectory, the tonic and the toxic. So all this was undertaken. By that time, we had outgrown Tide. When the subsequent grants were coming up, the Ford Foundation in particular said, unless it's for budget work, we cannot give it to you. So when CBPS was born, the word budget had to be there. But then I thought budgets were too narrow, and I smuggled in policy, so we became Center for Budgets and Public Policy. So that's how CBPS came in. The name came, and that's how we came into being. But the grants that they gave were very useful, and in February 98, last century, 98, we registered it. Many of those who signed the Memorandum of Association are here, and formed a board. And I guess the only reason that I was appointed director and not Poornima is the inherent patriarchy in our society. There is no other reason. Now, I'll move on from that to the early institutional development in CBPS. How does an organization work? Now, I had come from academic institutions. There was hierarchy, there were government rules, there were ways in which you had to take approvals. So one of the things we did was that what matters is the work to be done. If field work had to be undertaken, it had to be undertaken. But one need not say that a junior would get X amount and a senior would get 3X amount for the same trip. So we worked it out on the basis of actuals. Everybody got the same amount. And whether it was Poornima, me, or other board members, or whoever went, along with the most junior research assistant that we had, we worked together, ate together, traveled together. Very often, Tyagarajan is here. He and I would share a room in a hotel, just to make the point that, look, it's the work that matters, it is not hierarchy. And over a period of time, this built trust, it built fraternity. We were talking about all of these things, so that we came to a point where The other point is that a large number of our young research assistants at that time were women. And if you're going to send them on field work, you have to make sure that they had to be safe. And the kind of government allowances for overnight stay and all that was so ridiculous that, they'd have to stay in shady places near bus stops. So instead of that, we said, no, stay in a safe place. And if you need to travel by cab, travel by cab. And the fortunate thing was we didn't blindly adopt rules from ISEC or anywhere else. We had very good friends among chartered accountants. And we said that, look, this is what you want to do, frame your rules accordingly. So we came up with a thing saying fieldwork is to be dealt with in this way. So if we all travel by third-class sleeper, now that was fine. There was no hierarchy involved. And I think things of this sort were extremely important in building that trust. One of the things that Poornima did was to say that every day about 4 o'clock, we'd go out and buy some fruit and everyone in the office was given a banana or an orange or whatever. And she told me at home later that, look, many of them can't afford fruit, so let's give it to them. We serve tea, coffee anyway, what's wrong? And it's interesting to see that practice continues 25 years down the line. So there are some things, and we haven't yet reached a point where these policies which were tonic then have become toxic. They still seem to work. But the other thing that came, and this was the biggest challenge I faced, and I want to know if many of you face this, getting funding was never a problem. In fact, there were times we had to refuse because, we have 5 or 6 people and we can't do everything. So we tried to secure enough funding. And when you look back on it, a 2 lakh grant was a big thing in those days. Nowadays, I don't think we'd even write a proposal for that amount. The difficult thing was finding people who could work. Those who came from many of our universities got degrees, they got first classes, but they couldn't do the most simple things. So there was a need for training and retraining. And we would train people, they'd work with us, they would learn what to do it, and then they would get another job with some other organization that paid better. The cycle of recruitment, training, retraining repeats. It's one of those things that keeps going on forever. I think Jyotsna will tell you that we still face that. It is the biggest challenge, and finding good people at any level is an extremely difficult thing in research organizations. The other question was, how do we maintain quality? If you're in a university, then there would be internal seminars, you would exchange papers, there would be comments given to you. So there was some kind of a mechanism by which you would get feedback. But here there was 2 or 3 of us who was research guides and a whole lot of research assistants. And so we had to, and the mechanism we found had nothing to do with the memorandum of association. We invited a very eminent economist, Dr. K.S. Krishnaswamy, who had retired as Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, who was very helpful to us. And we said, look, we will have an advisory committee, please chair it, and we will present any work we've done to you. Now, the way Dr. Krishnaswamy functioned was to look at the topic and the paper we did and say, well, for this topic, invite Professor X or so-and-so. So in most meetings of the advisory committee, we'd have at least 3 people. Dr. Krishnaswamy as chair and 2 others whom he suggested. And we got a regular practice started by which even at the proposal stage we went to them. They would debug it, they would advise us, we would change it. And when we were halfway through the project, we'd make another presentation. And when the final thing was done, we would share a draft of the final. And until and unless Dr. Krishnaswamy said, now you can send it out, we wouldn't go. And this applied as much to me as it applied to a research assistant. We were absolutely insistent on this. And I think that one of the reasons that we didn't get into any serious trouble is that we had this process by which, before any trouble started, we got the work debugged. It's an extremely satisfying. As for the young people who worked with us and who left, I'm very happy to say that they're doing extremely well. I've got a list here. Anaka Iyer is now a assistant professor in the University of Nevada. Sandeep is an assistant professor in the University of New South Wales. Shubhansha Bakshi is in the economic service of the British government. It's a very interesting position, the British IES, I guess. There are many of them. Arundhati Gupta, who worked with us, went on to found an organization called Mentor Together, where she gets young idealistic managers in the corporate sector. I'm surprised to find they exist. And puts girls from disadvantaged communities in touch with them. They act as mentors. They volunteer their time, and it is having an amazing impact. Arundhati has been recognized as a global leader in the World Economic Forum. I don't see her here, but I had invited her. So there were a lot of these kind of things. So what I presented you to as a problem that CBPS faced, I think on the flip side did a lot of social good. Somebody benefited from the little work that we did, and I think I'm very happy about that. In fact, Meenakshi Raji, who worked with us, left and took the RBI chair in ISEC, the chair that I had vacated many years earlier. So it feels extremely good that all this did happen. Another point I want to make is that when we were working with the panchayats and municipalities, there was enthusiastic welcome from elected people and a subtle resistance from the local civil servants. The block development officer, the district planning officer, the panchayat secretary, they were totally opposed to it. They would often tell me, why are you involved in, do a seminar, we will come and we will implement. Why are you telling them, they're uneducated, they don't know what they're doing. And Karnataka had an interesting word. They were important because they were officials. And they could be transferred, the authority of government. And these elected people were called non-officials. And in that one term, they were completely dismissed. It's an extremely interesting thing how language can be used to exclude. In fact, many of the members I met, I learned interestingly that English has interesting uses in India. A lot of the members of the Gram Panchayat, when you talk to them, say, are you a member? No, I'm a number. The member was the Panchayat Adhyaksh or the secretary or the one in office. Everyone else just, why number? They were needed for a quorum. It's totally amazing how language works. Now, there were several other points I can talk about. Arun is here. We had a project on rural industrialization. The reports are available. We got grants from MacArthur, Action. In fact, ActionAid once offered to give me money to buy a Jeep. And I got more scared than ever in my life. Imagine having to hire a driver, send these young women to the field, and the driver gets drunk. So I said no. And we'd much rather depend on taxis. My friends in ActionAid couldn't believe that an offer to buy a Jeep was rejected. I've already talked about the work that Poornima did with the thing. Another piece of work that we did, which gave us a lot of benefits, was the Karnataka Expenditure Reforms Commission, which was chaired by the former Chief Secretary B.K. Bhattacharya. They had a huge mandate, and along with many others, we went into it, and it gave us a chance to understand a lot of very interesting questions. How does the government look? And I personally got a lot of insights from it, which I'll come to because more on the nature of my conclusions. But it gave us an opportunity. For example, the World Bank was coming in and telling us to price everything. Karnataka had a tradition where the Maharaja was good and drinking water was given to you. Schools were given. The Maharaja is a good man, he gave it to you. But then slowly you had to price all these things. And how do you price them? So the word is user charges. So we had a look at, and I learned some economics from it because there's a famous Ramsey rule for cross subsidies that you could, we applied it. And we came up with some kind of proposals for a progressive system of pricing things like drinking water. What happened later, I don't know, but this is what we did. But that opportunity gave us another chance to interact closely with the government. And I tend to be on a confrontative path because, criticize budgets, write somewhat acerbic articles in newspapers. And, people don't often like that. But the work that we did, and particularly the others in the organization, being of, I think, more friendly disposition, gave us a good relationship. We had also, through the Ford Foundation contacts, tied up with others doing similar work. There was some of them don't exist anymore. Vidhayak Sansad in Bombay, run by Vivek Pandit, who was interested in bonded labor and government allocations for freeing bonded labor. A very specific question. Madhusudan Mistry, who ran an organization called Disha, interested in the allocation and expenditure for the tribals of Gujarat. Mistry later, by the way, became a Congress MP. So the trajectory of some people is very interesting. They don't exist anymore. Several others came up later. Jagdananda started a budget center within CYSD. We also were put in touch with similar organizations abroad. We had very fruitful exchanges with an organization called Fundar in Mexico City, which very similar work to us. And the fact that they were working in a different country, different structure, and so on, helped us to contextualize our work a lot better, to understand that certain things are specific and certain things can be generalized. In 2009, that is 11 years after CBPS, we undertook a very detailed review. All those who funded us were invited. All those who acted as referees were invited. Friends in the NGO sector, government officials, anyone who in some way were invited. We had very intense discussions. The method was that the work we did were put into 4 categories, and we invited somebody who was an expert in that outside of us to read through all the work that we did, and they came and made the presentations on the work of CBPS as independent external scholars. And our job was to sit and listen and learn from the thing, and a report of that is outside. It's called Looking Back. So that was, Poornima made the concluding presentation of what we learned from that particular thing, and it was the last thing she did. After this review, I think the time had come for me to move on from directordom, and we were very lucky that we could persuade Jyotsna to leave the Commonwealth Secretariat in London and come and take over this thankless job. And I say thankless because at that point in time, we were small, we were difficult, but over the time that we've been there, you see what CBPS has become. We could hold something like this. It's 25 years. So I can say roughly that there have been 2 directors. So I don't want to say each of us had half the share, unless I say that she had the bigger half. I think that's the only way to put it. But we've had 5 presidents. The board decided long ago, it's a convention, and nobody would serve more than 2 terms. So we had constantly people coming, changing, and so on. So I'm the 5th one, and I'm on my 2nd term, and therefore it's the last one. So we have to see which way the organization goes after that. Now, commenting on CBPS after my time is a bit of a risky business. I was no longer an active participant in the work, but I've been an active observer. CBPS has been, I could always come in and demand a cup of tea, or if I wanted to meet some friend from outside, the office was available. So in these ways, I misused my position, but they never minded. So it's a nice relationship. I talked about the processes by which we built trust and worked, but they were at that time individual. They were director driven, and had I left and somebody else came, everything could have got tossed out. During Jyotsna's time, they've been codified. There's a set of rules and regulations finalized after a lot of internal discussion. And anyone who wants to see them can go to the website, leave policy, this, that, everything is there. So I think in that sense, CBP has become much more of an institution that can chug on its own and not depend on the vagaries of any one director. It's much. It's grown in size. You've seen the young people who are here. I feel sorry for some of them because they've had to answer your questions about 25 years of CBPS when they've barely been with us for 1 month. And that's the cross they have to bear. But it is much larger. The working environment is the same that you can see. And there is a body of work outside that you can all evaluate for yourselves. So what I can say is that CBPS is a vibrant institution. It's professionally and transparently managed. And this is the interesting bit. It's manned by very young people. And it is manned by a majority who are women. So that's a rather interesting, is again, the quirks of language. So it's what it is. It's delightfully vibrant. And I can put it in one sentence. CBPS I knew as a toddler. Today, it's a mature adult. And I think you have to deal with them in different ways. I want to now go back on this and look not so much at CBPS, but at the body of work that we did. And this is important because many others have taken it up now. Part of the Ford Foundation's networking meant that we met in Delhi, and a need was felt that, if you're going to work, this is a large country, we should have an organization in Delhi as a networking organization. The function of that would be to help the various agencies in the states to get information, data from Delhi. And those who were in Delhi wanted from the states, so it would be a positive kind of a network. And it was this that birthed the Centre for Budget and Governance Accountability in Delhi. But it's in Delhi, and I've had this mortifying experience of people, CBPS in Bangalore, you are an offshoot of CBGA. It's not. It's quite the other way around, but that's and I have invited CBGA, but I don't think anybody is here from there. The work that we do is not glamorous. It's tedious, it's boring, you have to go to places, you have to sit in offices with dusty and cobwebs and pick up documents. Many of the people are here. We worked in several states, so wherever we went, our local people knew the language. But for example, even in Karnataka, some of those who are from this had difficulty with the kind of Kannada in which the files were maintained. So there is a thing that is officially is Kannada, and there is a thing that literary Kannada, and the third thing, which is what I speak, which is street Kannada. So we had to deal with all this, but they have done it. And if you look at people like Madhusudan, we not only done it, he writes regularly in the Kannada press about the findings we get. So one thing, it is not glamorous work. It is not work that will get published in the American Economic Review. But it is nevertheless very important. And some of our publications have gone to strange places. A few of the papers that we published which went into EPW, I had an incredible readership. I had the interesting experience of landing up in various ministries or the Planning Commission and finding EPW on the table, and many of them knowing my name because of the article. It's an interesting experience. It would not have happened if I'd published in the American Economic Journal. I might have got some fancy job in the US. So first it is this. The second is that some of these results have in a very unobtrusive way fed into government. And it has also led to an interesting kind of collaboration. There was a time in Karnataka when the state had to submit a memorandum. I think it was the 13th Finance Commission. So the finance secretary, who became a friend over time, called me one day and said, I need help. I said, what do you do? So we went and talked to him, and then what we did was, over a period of about 10 days, I would go there at 4 o'clock. We would sit together to work. He would call all the people who had the data and the information. He would arrange the masala dosas. And we would work till midnight or later. And came up, and it probably is not quite correct to see it because the state government memorandum to the Planning Commission. But a lot of what we did went into it. And it was acknowledged by them. So in a sense, these kind of interrelationships helped us a great deal in what was going on. We could talk to them, they were confident they could say things to us and know that it won't land up in the wrong way in the press. So I think that what this means is that CBPS, which started as an institution looking for information from budgets to feed that back into various programs, has now grown into an institution which uses budget information as part of any other sources of information in order to contribute to informed debate on a whole series of issues by bringing in a great deal of domain knowledge. So I think that is an important thing. Now, CBPS also established itself nationally. Yesterday, Josna showed the slide of the states we work in and the place we do. She talked about her experience of holding a national seminar in Bangalore, which was not called legitimate. Earlier, I had the opposite experience. There was a very well-known funding agency which had funded a study in reproductive child health, which my wife handled. And they insisted on a national seminar which had to be held in Delhi. So we booked the ICSSR conference hall in Delhi. We went there, and it was a 2-day seminar with an agenda circulated in advance. A lot of people invited. And promptly at 9:30 we were there. Waited till 1 o'clock and nobody came, including the funders. So that is a national seminar. So I am, quite skeptical, and I don't think Delhi is a great place to be. I'm quite a critic. Now, what were my learnings? I think this is also possible. I mean, this is a lecture that I'm giving, and my learnings from all this. I would use an analogy. I think the budget is like the skeleton in the human body. It covers everything in some way, but it's a skeleton. A budget is like the skeleton. It has various parts, and we started by studying it as anatomy. What is the budget? What is the budget speech? What are the demand for grants? What is the link document? There are 9 separate, at least when I was studying, 9 separate volumes about this thick that are presented to Parliament. And I don't know if anybody has read all of them. But that is something that Massachusetts, we in CBPS have done. And having gone through all that, we found out that it is a skeleton because you want information on any part of the body, there is something in the budget that will tell it to you. But if you want to learn more, you need the physiology. How do these parts relate to each other? You want to study the lungs? You study the lungs. Budget will tell you something. But then the lungs are a separate domain altogether. And this idea of the relationship between the various parts in the budget, I used to call the physiology of the budget. And later on, you became more specialized and, you want to study children's budgets, and that is like studying nephrology. But the analogy holds. The other thing is that with the increasing supply-side economics dominating policy, the finance department got the responsibility for implementing what we call the FRBM, Fiscal Budget Ability and Budget Management Act, which in IMF language is the Fiscal Responsibility Laws. And the center passed it, the states passed it. And what does it do? Now, the philosophy of it is simple. The job of the government is very minimal, enforce contracts, run the police, look after foreign policy or defense, and then let the market do its thing. And therefore, in countries like India, where the government at that time had a hand in everything, schools, education, agriculture, this basically meant that you had to go towards a system where the government slowly reduced its involvement. Nobody ever said this. But it was put in broad terms like the government must live within its means. You have to be fiscally responsible. Now it is absolutely true that I get a certain salary, and if Mikoba's equation is something all of us know. For a year or two, I can spend more because I can draw on savings. But a point will come when I run into disaster. The government is not like that. See, there is a new term borrowed from architecture that we hear. You heard it here, fiscal space. Now this is a hall and it has a certain capacity. It's full right now, it looks like 200. Maybe it can accommodate 250 or 300. But if you want 500, you'll need another hall. So there is a space constraint. Now, what does it mean when you say there is a fiscal constraint? Space, there is no fiscal space. It starts with the assumption that tax revenues are fixed. They are fixed, and in an era when you're reducing taxes, whatever you had in the past is probably not realistic. You reduce taxes because you have to give incentives to those who invest, and therefore, don't tax the rich, reduce the taxes to the minimum. And yes, there was a case to reduce taxes. The 97% marginal tax of Indira Gandhi was obviously nonsense. And VP Singh became a hero when he reduced it to 67%. That may help him become Prime Minister. Today, the highest rate of tax is 30%. And you still hear industry and others saying that India is a very highly taxed country. And we ask them why, they say, remember 97%, but that was 50 years ago. Today, India's taxes are among the lowest in the world. Recently, before COVID, corporate tax was reduced further to 27%. Now, if you look at taxes in Singapore, look at taxes in in the United States, that bastion of capitalism, they are very much higher. And the right metric to use is the tax GDP ratio. In Europe, it's approaching 30%. In India, we have gone up to 16%. And if you look at comparable developing country, Brazil, it fluctuates between 28 and 30%. So this is an undertaxed country. It's undertaxed because those who have the ability to pay are not being taxed. Yes, we know that 2 or 3% of the people pay taxes. We have to widen the base. Yes, true. But it is also true that the rates of tax are those who have money. We also say that those who have to pay tax are Indian residents. And this is a very interesting point of view because a resident is one who lives in India for more than 181 consecutive days in the year. So you have a lot of business tycoons who have offices abroad who stay in India for 180 days and are therefore non-resident. They don't pay, they don't come under the income tax net. It's also true that for many of them, it's not salary that's important, it is dividends, and they are taxed very differently. I think a best example I have of Indian socialism is that a professor in this country pays the same rate of income tax as Mukesh Ambani if he paid tax, 30%. That's Indian socialism. I don't know if you think it's fair, but I think there's something wrong with it. India gave up the inheritance tax in the 80s, and we have abolished wealth tax more recently. And Jyotsna has been doing some work and she's making a case for bringing back the wealth tax. Now, the argument made is that if you start putting these taxes, those who have the money will not invest. Now, this is an empirical matter. It's not an abstract theoretical matter. So when you look at it, for example, on many occasions, taxes have been reduced. The statement made is the Laffer curve that if taxes are reduced, overall tax revenues will improve because of better compliance. But in India, every time we made this study, taxes have been reduced, but tax revenues have either shrunk or remained the same. They have not increased. Now, what about investments? Have those who got benefits invested? Yes, perhaps, but outside. If you look at the current situation in India, investments are not going up. Yet, if you look at Indian investments abroad, they are going up. So we have to look at these as empirical matters and take a stand. This is not purely ideological. So I have skipped some of the bits that we've learnt, but I think that is... As I said, the finance department became the custodian of fiscal rectitude, and they had a single metric, the fiscal deficit. Ashwini and I were just talking about it. Both of us got master's degrees from the Delhi School of Economics, never having heard of the fiscal deficit. What we did hear about was deficit financing. If there was under certain conditions for certain reasons, unemployment and underinvestment, the government could spend money. Keynes famously said, dig holes in the ground and fill them up, but give wages. The point was, the government would spend money on productive. It would give wages, the wages would be spent and would set up a virtual cycle. Now, under that, the government would spend, it would create money. Now, it would issue treasury bonds, which the Reserve Bank would monetize, and the money would come. A few years ago, an agreement, an MOU was signed with the Reserve Bank, which said no, they will no longer monetize automatically. It had to be negotiated between the RBI and the Government of India as to how much. This meant that government could not monetize, it had to borrow. And if you look at borrowings, the borrowings for government expenses gone up. Till 1981, the Government of India ran a revenue surplus. After 1981, we've had revenue deficits. But what is disturbing was that when we had a revenue surplus, that money was used for investment in the capital. And that's how we got our BHEL and HMT and SAIL and all the other public enterprises. But the last greenfield public enterprise was NALCO, which was 1979, if I remember. After that, there's been no investment, no modernization. Now, earlier on, Nehru had gone to the Finance Commission, and we all know the imbalance that's been talked about, states' responsibilities constitutionally given and the resources available in the Finance Commission, where the bulk of the money goes to the Union government. But this was because Nehru talked to the second and third Finance Commissions and said, look, we have got all these plans, we're to invest in all this, so please make sure that the center has the money to invest. And the way that investment was taken was a company was set up and the shares were given to the President of India. So, and if you look back on it, today the industrial backbone in this country comes from the capacities of these countries. BHEL is an important part of the Bombay Sensex. It's a public sector company. And many others, ONGC, GAIL, many of them. But yet, the belief is that the public sector is inefficient. One of my teachers, Professor K.N. Raj, once did a study comparing Tata Steel with Hindustan Steel, and after making adjustments for the various social activities, he found that efficiency is roughly the same. And he said there's no public and private, it's an Indian industry. That's a very interesting kind of a finding. So, if the government is not taxing, its revenues are dwindling, you have to depend on private sector. But there is pressure to make sure that social services, we are a poor country, you have to run food distribution, you have to give so the government has to spend money. It's rather niggardly about it, but this is now being financed by borrowing in the market. The problem with borrowing is that every time you borrow, in future years you have to pay interest. And we've reached a point where I think between 35 and 40% of the revenue of a state government goes in interest payments. Now, if we borrow more, then that will become 35, 36, 37 in future years. You're reducing your ability to do anything by taking so much borrowing. And unfortunately for the government, we are in an era where interest rates are increasing. So the 1,000 crores that you have to repay at X rate of interest is so much more when it is X plus something. So the government's ability to fund things is gone, and you close the door of raising tax revenue. So depend on the private sector. And that is the situation we are in. There's one last point I'd like to make. I started by saying that I got into all this after the constitutional amendments. Now, what is interesting to remember is that it was the Narasimha Rao government which unleashed, so to speak, the economic reforms. It's the same government that legislated the 73rd and 74th amendments. And the idea was that by deepening democracy, by deepening federalism, the efficiency of government's expenditure would improve. So the liberalization and so on that the reforms brought also meant that the areas in which government was spending would lead to greater efficiencies because now there were elected local bodies that could supervise the spending. And therefore, for the same rupee, you would get a better result. So it is one. But most economists deal with economic reforms didn't need constitutional amendments, and that's the domain of economists. And these constitutional are the domain of political scientists and something else. They never go together. But unless and until the structural changes brought in and some of the studies that we did prove that is indeed so, the efficiencies that are sought to be achieved are unlikely to be achieved. In Karnataka is a good example in the first Hegde round of decentralization. The Zilla Panchayat Adhyaksh was given the rank of Minister of State. He wrote the confidential reports of what was called the Chief Secretary of the district, who was a middle-level IS officer, senior to the collector. Now, this led to a certain amount of heartburn in the civil services. So as I already told you, this got overthrown. But the reviews, assessments that were done by very eminent people like L.C. Jain showed that changes and efficiencies had begun to come in, and they were nipped in the bud. I'm not aware of much more recent studies to compare it with. In fact, the government of Karnataka doesn't even talks of the State Finance Commission as having started after the 91 laws. But there was a finance commission under the 1983 Panchayati Raj Acts of Karnataka. And there was a finance commission chaired by a very eminent economist called R.M. Honavar. So I annoy my friends in the government by saying, if this is the first, there is the 0th finance commission report available. But you will find it is no longer available. There'll be some, I saw the dusty copy that L.C. Jain had and I could read it. I don't know where it is now. So basically, the laws have created decentralization, which is an administrative thing. Earlier, a decision was taken in Delhi, you delegated it to the state capital. And now you say you delegate it, but delegate it along the civil service chain. So the education secretary approves something based upon the budget. It goes down, and then the CEO or somebody approves it, and then the various line departments spend. So there is a health coming from the health department, and there are silos. This is decentralization. But federalism is something different. Federalism would mean that there is an elected government. There should be a budget. Why can't there be a budget session in Dharwad in April, where you say all the monies that are coming in from various schemes, this side, all our plans for expenditure on that side, and there is a presentation made by a member of the Zilla Panchayat to the entire Zilla Panchayat body. Now, the Zilla Panchayat does not have the power of law. That is true. But is that the only reason for not doing it? Because what this does is it makes transparent the money is available, the choices that are being made, and both the elected representatives and the local officials get to know what is available. And you can use the help of the elected representative in getting things done. I'll give you an example. Today, it is some fellow in the agriculture department who says, I've got a money for 2 wells in this panchayat, and he decides where the wells are dug. Now, on the other hand, if it was part of the elected body, there is an elected set of panchayat members. You tell them that we've got money for 2 wells. They'll talk among themselves, say, this year do dig these, next year we'll dig those. So, you won't have this phenomenon of wells that are dug and then which nobody can find later. So, there is a difference between decentralization and deepening federalism. What the constitutional amendments have achieved is decentralization. I think the intent was deepening federalism, and I take inspiration from Brazil, where the constitution says that the land of Brazil consists of the national government located in Brasilia, the provincial governments located in the various provincial capitals, and municipalities at the local level. They don't have rural-urban distinctions. Municipalities are various. Well, there are 6,000 municipalities. And under the constitution, the elected head called the mayor, in his jurisdiction is the boss. there was a court case in which one of the presidents wanted something done in his municipality. And the mayor said no, and the mayor had his way against the president of the country. This won't happen in our land. So I want to say that what we've achieved a lot. Now, what does all this mean when it comes to CBPS? I think we have to look at a few things. I've often seen that when something is not working, for example, in many of our own studies, we say that, there is money for child nutrition, but it's not being spent properly. And I say, why is there's a lack of political will? Now, mine is the opposite position. I think the government is elected and its political will is reflected in the money it decides to spend. So the money is allocated, and if you are not spending it on child nutrition, there is a political will not to spend. And by saying there's a lack of political will, we are basically copying out. Because what is needed is to organize struggle. Earlier today, both Aruna Roy and Shanta Sinha said fight. I think you have to organize and fight to say that change the political will. This is what we want. So in a sense, my personal learning has been don't fall for this lack of political will stuff. Then what about how do agencies like CBPS work? We are registered under the Societies Registration Act in 1960. But it is a copy of the Mysore Registration of Societies Act of 1860, with Mysore being replaced by Karnataka and Diwan being replaced, whatever. So it's not even a very smart cut and paste job. So the result of it is that all the controls that the British government put in to control civil society, after all, they thought these were rebellious people who would overthrow them, and they were right. But those are there, and there is this office called the Registrar of Societies with incredible powers. In fact, and I don't know if that's the case today, but at least when I was running CBPS, we had just computerized and we could print out minutes of meetings, and I thought sticking them in a book is enough. Then I was told, no, under the Societies Registration Act, you must maintain what is called a minutes book and must be handwritten. So I had to get all this handwritten, employ somebody to do that. The notice for an annual general meeting has to go by registered post. Email notifications are not enough. So there are a lot of these things which have to change. Now, it is not my case that there is no regulation required or that no law is. But the point is we have multiple laws. CBPS registered under the Income Tax Act, FCRA, shops and all kinds of GST, and we comply with everything because we've got a rather strict auditor who ensures that we do. But the question I have to ask is, can you put the Bangalore Little Theatre, Rangashankara, CBPS, and the Karnataka Society for Promotion of Irrigation, which is a government society, all in the same boat and registered by the same law? I mean, isn't there a difference? The way you would deal with a society with an income of 50 crores should be different from a way you deal with some small NGO dealing with 5 lakhs. I mean, it's a matter of saying that, and this you do for companies. Under the Companies Act, your private limited companies, large corporations, all kinds of differences exist. But here there is one omnibus law, which is, in recent years, it has been administered with the presumption of guilt. You have violated all the laws unless all your documents show that we can't prove that you violated the laws. This is like the famous statistical thing where you can't accept a hypothesis, you can only reject it. And it's a very strange thing that it is happening here. So the question that I'm asking, and we have Sujit Krishnaswamy who heads the law school, can the laws be simplified? All countries have a law. The US has a law, the Britain has a charities law. We have a law. But should you start with the presumption of guilt? Can it be implemented with a lighter touch? Is that possible at all? And is it possible to deal with very large agencies differently from those which are very small? These are open questions, but I think that this is something that we should ask. And finally, the last point is that we are a research agency. Research takes a long time. I am talking to you about learnings over a 25-year span. But accountability is in project cycles, the largest of which is 3 years. Donors come to you with the famous log frame, and you're put in a straitjacket and you have to. Is it possible to think in terms of research agencies as a category by themselves and make the laws around funding research somewhat different? You know, CSR is a lot of money, but it's explicitly defined to exclude research. Now, where do research agencies get money to survive? We are not consultants making consultant money. So I think research is a long-term activity. I'm saying by all means have accountability, but also have a way by which agencies like CBPS could have a corpus fund, you can live on the interest. Nowadays, you have any donation you get, you have to spend within a specified time. You can't keep, there should be some ways of dealing with all this. So, the famous log frame which funders swear by, to me is the Procrustean bed. There is nothing short of that. Now I do not have a solution. I ask only for a thoughtful debate on these things. And Vidhi, it's time for you to do your thing. Where does CBPS go from here? And the answer is in Kishore Kumar. See, technology. That song is something. So I tried to be sophisticated.
चल के तुझे मैं लेके चलूं एक ऐसे गगन के तले जहां गम भी न हो आंसू भी न हो बस प्यार ही प्यार पले.
Yeah, so sorry. He had taken us to a dream land. We have to come back. So sorry about that, but no option. And I was just thinking, listening to him, that one has to be thankful for so many things. For example, adding policy to budget. Otherwise, a lot of things that we do today we won't be doing. And having all those things, starting from fruits in the afternoon that Poornima started, to having the practice of advisory committee, which we have continued in a different way. Many of you have been part of our research advisory committees. So, so many things have not changed in that sense from his time to our time. And Madhusudan talked about trust and entrust, and that definitely I have experienced in, like 13 years ago, when he and the board put that trust in me and others and entrusted the job, and that has, had its, the way it was done, it was very critical. And but so certain things have not changed, but certain things have changed, like we rarely have an opportunity to refuse funding anymore. We do refuse work, certain kinds of work we do not do, but not because the kind of work that we don't want to do, that we say no to, but it's not that the kind of work that we want to do we have ready money for, and that remains a challenge. And he was talking about wealth tax. So recently, we have decided that this year we will try to generate, we don't have any such fund so far, but we will try some fundraising. So I met someone who has a very good name actually in fundraising. And the day I met, I had forgotten that I had also sent an article, and next morning that article on wealth tax came. And he sent me a message saying that now you approach all these high net worth individuals with a helmet. So, so much so for fundraising. Yeah, but then I think there is a Chal Ke Tujhe, and that continues to work. There are tomorrows, there are dreams, and there are people, there are institutions. And this morning we have heard all of them. Definitely Aruna, Roy, Shanta Sinha, but also others' experiences. And then that tells you that, these are exercises worth doing, and institutions worth running and continuing to work for and do that. And when we actually, had detailed, long discussions about the theme of the conference that we wanted to do for our 25th year. So it was a very conscious choice that we talked about, we chose institutions and public policy, and the fact that we, chose everything very, very carefully, themes, sub-themes, which connected with our work, which connected with our concerns, connected with the commitments that we have had, and the world outside, the way we look at, the way we dream about. And this morning we had a very, very good discussion on independent institutions. And in that light, when we thought of evening lecture and Prof. Vyasulu delivering that evening lecture, we thought of institutions, Bangalore institutions. Some of them he has had a close connection with, but even otherwise, and we do, they are large institutions, they are public institutions, but as you see, and they are small, large, but there are certain common thread when it comes to institutions, which we saw actually today in all the discussion. And we decided that we will request actually you all to come, and readily actually acknowledged. So unfortunately, Rajshekhar is not here. He is traveling internationally, so ISEC director. And he has had close connections with ISEC. It would have been nice to have him, but he's traveling, he's not here. Then we asked Rishikesh Krishnan, he's director of Bangalore. He readily agreed, and he has, he has a connection with Bangalore, but they also have otherwise connected. We asked Sudhir Krishnaswamy, Vice Chancellor of National Law University of Bangalore, and he readily agreed. We asked our very own Shreelata, she's also a board member, and who is heading Bangalore PHFI now, and she readily agreed. So I invite all three of you to come and share your, whatever response you have, whatever you have to say on the topic itself. You have looked at the theme that we have. You have heard Prof. Vyasulu. So before we, go for dinner and some celebrations, as we call it, it will be nice to hear three of you. Please come.
Let me start by thanking CBPS for having me here this evening. It's a great pleasure to be here. I also want to thank my panelists for letting me strong arm my way to the top of the line, because I don't want to be the last thing standing between you and your dinner. So I'm happy to be the first in line. But I want to really thank you for letting me be here on your frabjous day, Vinod, and congratulate you, because to steer an institution for 25 years and have it grow and flourish is no mean achievement. And I think it's a wonderful day to be here and to help and to participate in this. My association with CBPS has been a very long one. When we came back to India in 1998, I think very soon after that, we started reconnecting with old friends, and of course, Vinod and Poornima were high on the list, and I started very quickly getting invited to various events at CBPS, and then it started, I was invited to meetings, and those meetings were quite frequent and so on. And what I remember so clearly from those moments were Poornima's, energy and passion and commitment that she used to bring to those gatherings. And a lot of what Vinod spoke about a little earlier actually resonates a lot with me. One of the things I remember clearly was a film that she had made along with Deepa and I suppose Anita Kaul, although I don't remember that, on reproductive health. And it was a very moving film. And the other day I was looking through some old boxes of books and I found that CD of a young girl actually, and the challenges that she faced in being able to access safe maternity care. It was, at that time, it was quite a path-breaking film, I remember. But apart from that, I think the ideas and the philosophy that she brought to her work, I think that ethos, as clearly, both Jyotsna and Vinod were acknowledging, still sustain at CBPS. And one of them, of course, is the way that she took the work down to the Gram Panchayats with the training programs that she ran over there, innumerable. In the early days when the amendments had just come in, and there was a great need for capacity building, and especially of the women Gram Panchayat members, because there was a lot of anxiety about how these new arrangements were going to work and so on. And I know that she spent a great deal of time and energy doing all that work. And also her other, the way she approached research and the kind of democratic ideology that she brought to it, that everyone stayed together, ate together, went to the field together, and it created a sort of a way of producing knowledge that was really truly reflective of a democratic spirit. So I really miss her presence today, and I know that she would have been very happy to have been here. However, I think, listening to Vinod today has made me also realize I also now lead a very similar institution to CBPS, and essentially committed to the idea of knowledge production, research, and trying to influence policy, and at a larger level influence the discourse around issues of social equity and social justice. And I think institutions like ours can really learn a lot from one another. I was very comforted to hear about, the turnover of people, the precarity of support. I think these are things that we all live with, all the time, especially institutions like ours that operate on soft money. And so it's nice to know that there are others in the same boat, and that there's a way of getting past it and lasting for 25 years. So that's certainly encouraging. But I also have, 3 takeaways, I would say. I want to confine myself to 3 from what Vinod just said. The first one, I would say, is that it's very important to figure out what questions we want to ask. What is the scope of the work that we want to do, and how do we ensure that it's rigorous, that it's reflexive, that it stays relevant, that it's current, and so on. From what we heard, CBPS was launched at a time when there was the amendments to the constitution around decentralisation. It was also the time of the economic changes that were taking place in terms of liberalisation and so on. And it was becoming, I think, increasingly clear at that time that budgets, could not confine their concerns just to markets, but had to expand beyond that to look at social sectors, but particularly at issues of social justice and equity and so on. And to do that, a public policy lens was really was critical. And to just look at the way budgets were being prioritized, how money was being distributed, and so on. Yesterday at our center, we had an excellent colloquium where the speaker was unpacking the health budget for 2023. And that level of granularity, looking at the way monies have been allocated, it was, it was depressing, and it was, it also shook us up to really understand the direction in which policies and programs were moving, which we had already feared and suspected, but there was now evidence to support that. But looking at the health budget and so on is what we would call something of a legacy issue. It's something that's been done for decades, and there's been a lot of debate around it. But there are so many new issues coming up, climate change, global warming, environmental justice, and so on and so forth. And those kinds of issues require the same rigorous, critical study that many of these other issues have received over a long time. And so, asking the right questions, I think, is a very important starting point. The second thing I kind of noted was what are going to be the spheres of influence for our work? And I think CBPS has really grappled with that quite a lot. I mean, are we going to, pitch our work towards global platforms? Sometimes what happens is that you get funding and the funding kind of dictates where you pitch your work. But there's actually a lot of latitude in how you can, design and carry out the research that you do and the knowledge production that you do. So we need to make a judgment call, I think, whether it's going to be global, whether we're going to try and do advocacy and activism at the national level, or is it going to be at the panchayat level? And that was, I think, a critical choice that perhaps CBPS made, was that they would work not necessarily only as advocates or activists, but also as people who wanted to build capacity, to empower, and to, build institutional, capacity at the grassroots level. Now, the lesson that I would take away from this is that there are lots of possibilities out there, and often it's important to be at the right place at the right time. Very often it is serendipity that you find yourself there, but it also can and probably should be more strategic. So finding, ways in which to engage strategically with the right stakeholders or the right actors at the right time, I think that's very important for institutions like ours to keep in mind. Finally, how does one share the knowledge that one produces? And here I would say that, as academics and researchers, of course, the temptation is to publish in a peer-reviewed, high-impact journal, get an article in the Lancet that's like winning the gold medal. But that might not always achieve what you're hoping to with the work that you've done. And I think Vinod actually spoke about that and pointed to all the publications that are out there in the lobby. Democratizing knowledge and being able to communicate it with the people who really need to know, that's an art in itself. And I think that's something that research institutions have to keep in mind. I mean, for example, there's the election coming up. And how do you talk to people about the budget and make it real for them and make it something that becomes salient in their day-to-day life? That, the midday meal that their child is going to get is not going to be as good as before because it hasn't been funded as well, or something that really means something in the way they live, in the space that they occupy. So making information available in ways that are really accessible, I think that should be one of the measures of success of our knowledge production process. Some of these, obviously, these are issues that one can debate for a long time, and different people will have different ways in which they respond to this, and different institutions have to trace their own path. But in our current juncture, I think it's very important to bring science and rigorous analysis and generate credible and robust evidence to be able to speak truth to power. So I will end by congratulating CBPS again, because you have successfully negotiated a quarter of a century of global economic upheavals, wavering economic philosophies, changing national and state governments, social transformations, your own internal upheavals, all of that, to be able to come to today when you can celebrate your silver jubilee. So I will say, Kalu, Kale, and I think you will all earn the right to chortle in your joy. Thanks.
So let me start like Shreelata did, by thanking Jyotsna for the invitation and Vinod for setting this occasion up and inviting us to be a part of this panel. I'm sure we're all glad to be here to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the institution, and 25 years for any institution is significant, but to bootstrap a civil society institution, especially one that's focused on research and policy initiatives, is particularly so. I think it's fair to say that institution building is a structural weakness in our culture. It's not highly valued, and it's not something we do very well. We have many pitfalls in the wider culture, but particularly in the way we build institutions. And so we have learned much from the narration earlier this evening about the art and craft of building institutions that work, and trying to pull together people who may not all be of the same mind necessarily, but have enough of a common interest to be directed in a particular way. And that's educative. We don't do this often enough. There's very little of a culture of reflection and sharing on institutional learning, and I really appreciate that kind of attention to the grammar of institution building that we heard earlier this evening. And I hope that it motivates us to do more of this, because these institutional spaces are precious, and we have to find ways to sustain and recreate them. The main theme for this conference, and some of the reflections that Vinod led this evening with, was to talk about public policy and institutions. And I want to just say a little bit about the main theme in a broad sort of way. I don't want to try and dive deep, but say something broadly about it. The idea that we can teach or understand public policy as a discrete body of knowledge is relatively new in this country, and if I were to push the boat out, I'd say still less than established. There are very few credible programs of teaching public policy, and even the ones that exist are on sort of shaky ground. So it's public policy. Clearly, public policy is not a discipline. If anything, we'd say it's a field of inquiry, and it's multidisciplinary in nature. And Vinod has already shared that to do that with rigor and both an attention to empirical data as well as affective connection with subjects is very hard to do, because it's calling on a certain range of skills and attributes that are uncommon, at least to exist in the same person. So how are you going to even teach this? So I've won this difficult task in at least two institutional spaces, first at the Azim Premji University and now at the National Law School, and watched this process over 2 decades, how does one structure an inquiry into public policy, and how does one teach? Because what you want to get out of it is a rather complex product. My experience in this process has been that institutions like CBPS are useful, not only as spaces for our students to both intern and work at, but also as a useful reflection point. So if we say that this is how public policy is done, then we have a mirror, a refractive mirror to think about how we might educate for a professional vocation like this. And so I'm very glad to be here for the reason that we have looked at your work and engaged. I mean, unlike Shreelata, who's a very direct connection to CBPS, my connection is much more indirect and distant, but nevertheless an engaged one. And I just want to mention that because I feel that that might not be part of your 25-year history, but it's an important part in the wider environment in which we operate. I'm going to suggest that there are many questions of public policy, but the question of institutional choice is one that at least in academic literature surfaced and has grown in importance from the mid-1990s. And deserves, and it's sometimes phrased as this minor choice, is it states or markets that should make a particular, should occupy a particular field, and this is the simple way in which the question is posed. But I'm partial to a presentation of the question that Adam Zurofsky does in a very important book written in the late 1980s, when much was changing in the world, but particularly the collapse of the USSR, where he poses the question as being a choice about systems of allocative decision making. We have many systems of allocative decision making in our societies. We know that the two dominant systems are a decentralized market and a relatively centralized state, but it has some it has some autonomy even in that, and I'm talking here about democratic states, some autonomy and decentralization even in the political state. And the real question that we battle with is whether, how we toggle between these choices. What questions do we place as being questions that the allocative efficiency of markets can do the job, and what questions do we think that allocative choice should really be left to politics? And this question is something that, or this way of framing questions is not something that we have internalized very well in Indian policy debates or in Indian academic work in this field. And this, it's not new. I'm not suggesting that this is like last 3 years, 4 years discovery. It's an old framework, old enough framework, but not one that we have been able to understand, teach very well, or adapt to very well. The ways in which the institutional choice question is framed and answered in current research seems to duck the foundational normative question of how you make the allocative decision itself. To what institutional structure would you confer allocative authority? And this kind of question we have not been very good at asking and answering. And I suspect that I haven't had the opportunity to be here through the day. Maybe that's what you were talking about, in which case I'm just preaching to the converted. But I think that allocation question is really the question of our time, and one that I would emphasize in public policy conversations. So 3 decades, almost 3 decades of work at CBPS requires all of our recognition and commendation to both leaders of the teams as well as the members of the teams. And Vinod mentioned that many of you are here in the audience. So a big congratulations, and I look forward to actually learning more, because as I was listening to you and you said there's a lot of literature outside, I look forward to picking some of that up and understanding. I have a narrow, an awareness of a narrow awareness of your work, and I'd look to learn more in the years ahead, and get more of my students to work and engage with you. I was struck by your comment that you keep refusing money or something like that. So, I mean, it said enough. It said enough to say that it was a different age, and I think Jyotsna quickly corrected that impression. So let me say that I think it's very clear for anyone in this room that the first 25 years will be nothing like the next 25. I think that we see a set of challenges. Funding might be one of them, but there's much else that we need to be looking at and thinking about, in a new kind of institutional dexterity. You've already mentioned navigating regimes, political regimes, and all the conditions of work that any institution needs to do to survive. I think the next 25 years will be another level of dexterity to ensure that you thrive and excel. But I'm going to close with that last question that Vinod threw in, and he suggested that I should say something about legal regulation and the presumption of guilt as a regulatory strategy. I don't want to speak to that direct question, but I want to say something which is slightly broader, but I think relevant to the question that you ask, which is to take a historical view of the legal organization of civil society in India. I think all of us understand, or maybe it's not common knowledge, and I should just repeat it, that it was the 1970s that saw the enactment of the FCRA legislation, as well as a host of other legal and regulatory strategies around civil society. We understand that the 1973 and 1975 were not the heydays of democracy in India. We had a political leader who thought she was under siege or subject to a coup of some sort, and what followed was a very drastic regulation of both markets and civil society. So it was not just the nationalization of industry, as well as the acquisition of land, which was radically, the legal regimes were radically changed. It was at the same time that we put in place an architecture of control over civil society. In the 1990s, something quite different happened, that we suddenly gave up on the acquisition of land at least in a redistributive sense. We also gave up on the regulation of industry, and so there was a certain level of opening up that we might call a liberalization of markets. But there was no let up on the question of civil society. What's interesting is that FEMA, which was the companion statute, I should not use acronyms, so the Foreign Contribution Act being the regulation of civil society incomes, and the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act, as it was then called, the FERA Act, which was the regulation of business and foreign exchange. The Foreign Exchange Regulation Act was amended 4 times, and the name of the act has changed. It's called the Foreign Exchange Management Act. And we have seen over a period of 20 years, starting from 1991, a very significant dilution of foreign exchange controls. At the same time, we witnessed a very stringent reinstatement of foreign contribution regulation in the civil society sector. So I think that the simple point must be that that kind of sectoral reform has to be uppermost on the agenda, apart from everything else we do. Because if reasonably hospitable conditions for the existence of civil society must exist in the decades to come, some of this regulatory framework must change. I think that the pedantic regulation of the Societies Act, what you mentioned, the writing of minutes registers by hand and so on, is almost what we can survive. There's much else in the regulatory system that is almost fatal to the survival of the civil society sector. And we should all be paying careful attention to that in the years ahead. So let me stop there and pass on to Rishi.
Yeah, good evening. First, let me congratulate CBPS, Vinod, Jyotsna, and everyone else who has been involved for this important milestone in the history and evolution of the organization. When I was listening to Vinod, I also started thinking about IIM Bangalore's journey in the policy space. We are just entering our golden jubilee year in next month. So we are reached an important milestone as far as policy studies are concerned. Many of you would know that when IIM Bangalore was founded in 1973, it was founded with a public system and public policy focus. In fact, in its early years, it was largely organized around different sectors of the economy and society. Of course, that particular structure underwent some modification in the 1890s as the nature of our economy and polity also changed. So just like Sudhir was just mentioning the origins of FCRA and FERA, our institute was also founded in that era. And therefore, in a way, our focus was very much on the themes of that time. So if you just look back at the history of IMB's policy work, we had one phase which was the sectoral phase, which I just mentioned. The sectors went into some kind of, I don't know what's the right word, they were sort of slowly chipped away and the sectors kind of disappeared at some point. But then we came back with a Center for Public Policy in the year 2000, partly under a UNDP-sponsored effort to develop policy capabilities in India. It was realized that while you might have economic liberalization on the one hand, it certainly doesn't mean that the need for governance goes away, and policy would continue to play an important role. And it was under that umbrella that we started the Center for Public Policy in the year 2000, and it's completed 20 odd years at this point of time. I think an important comparison or contrast between a public policy activity in a large publicly funded institution with the kind of focus we have seen here at CBPS is the ability of an organization like CBPS to be much more focused, to seek impact in a slightly narrower space, but have the benefit of chipping away at something over an extended period of time. On the other hand, in an institution like ours, a lot of the research agenda is driven by individual researchers. It's relatively more difficult to get people to work together on broader themes. And it also depends a lot on what kind of cumulative work happens over time. So while of course we have had outstanding researchers at IIM Bangalore, and of course Vinod himself was a valued colleague for many years, if I just look back and see, it's difficult to identify very specific areas in which we have had long-term cumulative impact. Though of course there are several scholars who made an impact in their own right. So I think one great benefit of academic entrepreneurship or research entrepreneurship of the kind we have seen in an organization like CBPS is the ability to focus on certain key and related issues and then make a sort of cumulative contribution on those issues over time. And I particularly like the way Vinod tried to run a thread through many of the different projects and different themes that CBPS has worked on over time. And I particularly believe that there's a very important space for organizations or institutions like CBPS, considering the range of challenges we have as a country. And we certainly need more and more specialized institutions that can adopt that kind of a focus and have a more historical, grounded political economy view in contrast to the somewhat fragmented way in which public institutions work. In particular, if I just look at our trajectory today in an institute like IIM Bangalore, because we have become much more internationally oriented, we are in a way much more worried about things like global rankings. As a result, our focus on these very fancy journals has gone up. We pay, maybe I shouldn't say this as the director, but I think we pay a little less attention to exactly what we find rather than whether we are actually getting all those fancy publications. And which looks nice, of course, when you look at our rankings and record, but I'm not sure it always works in an ideal way as far as impact is concerned. So I would like to urge CBPS to continue, in the same, with the same philosophy that they have had over the years. And I really hope that we will see many continuing years of outstanding, relevant output from CBPS going forward. I think the challenge is to combine rigor and relevance, and from whatever I heard from Vinod and whatever I've heard about CBPS before, I think you're really doing a wonderful job in that direction, and I hope you will sustain it. If I can just end with a small personal note. I've known Vinod for about roughly the age of CBPS. I think I came to know him somewhere in the mid-90s. And he's always been extremely supportive of whatever we've been doing at IMB, even though he left several years ago. He's also been very generous with his time whenever we have reached out to him. So I'd like to particularly thank him for all his support and continuing engagement with IIM Bangalore. And this is maybe slightly embarrassing, but another personal note, Jyotsna's brother was actually my contemporary at IIT. So I've known him at least for much longer, actually for close to 40 years now. So, there are many connections, and I certainly wish all of you at CBPS a very fruitful, ongoing research journey. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And, it's amazing. I was just thinking that how I know three of you actually joined us in the evening, but in this, those of us who have been here since morning, it has been such a rich day in terms of ideas, discussions, and even in your brief interjections, all three of you have actually touched upon very, very significant, very important ideas that we need to engage with. So thank you for that. And of course, thank you. I know it's you are our own, yet since the time we told him that we want you to do this lecture, he has been engaged with that, how should I do this? What are the things that I should be emphasizing? And that's again inspiring, because you don't take anything non-seriously. And that's an important thing, that, we don't take anything for granted, and you engage whatever you have to do with rigor, with full attention, with full passion. So, all of you, so thank you. All of you have been with us since morning. It has been a very, very long day, but I'm sure very engaging day, despite it being long. So now we'll go and have dinner